button now, and so we have this documented. And I want to start by framing it a little bit more again, so you know what you're getting yourself into. So you're probably more than even more than me and longer than me aware of the game B thinking, right? So the ideas, and I'm not referring to game B specifically, just as because it's a great image to use. So that we're moving towards, or have to move towards, a new civilization design in some way. And while you are probably much more on the techno-utopian side than I am still, I want to follow a path in which we create maximum resiliency through not relying on too many of the systems we're using at the moment. And this is one of those paths could be what Jordan Hall calls the civium, the small communities of people who are self-sufficient, self-reliant, but hopefully globally connected, and with the capacity to share stuff. That's the rough idea we have in our minds. Now we're having conversations with people who with the most amazing brains that we find across the globe, um, uh, in order to understand more about how that's done, how such a community could actually live and thrive, maximizing everybody's well-being and minimizing the negative footprint or negative externalities in general. And things we look at are how do you build houses? How do you live off the land? How do you create culture? How do you create governance? I had a beautiful conversation, for example, with Matt Pruitt, around the governance questions. And how do you stay sane and healthy in all of this? Right. So it's just as a global frame for the spectrum of things. And the way we do this is pretty open, but at the same time as concrete as possible. So we ask two questions. First, who are you? And how is your brain configured, and why? You know that question. So to give people context of who you are. So you can riff on that for like 5, 10, 15 minutes, however much you want. And then the second question is, okay, now imagine you are somewhere on the planet, somewhere in the outback, mostly disconnected from the rest of humanity, with 100, 200, 300, 1,000 people max. How do you build a community in your perspective, with your knowledge? What are the things that are important? What would you bring to the table? What would you leave at home? What would you not want to bring in from this current mode of civilization? So you can feel totally free to let your brain go on this, and just riff on this freely, because we will always learn something useful and amazing through that. So that's the framing. And with that, I would, unless you have questions, just open it and let you start riffing about yourself.
Of these two things, right? Sort of, background info, and then the sort of what would I do if I was more closer to, more basic stuff at the level of the infrastructure of Nature 1.0. And you basically asked me, how do I build community where there's sort of the infrastructure of Nature 1.0 plus some more basic tools that humans have developed so far. And I'm happy, I'm happy to.
Or maybe even you can expand in the Nature 2.0, right? That's not a problem.
Okay.
I just gave you my view on things. That doesn't have to be yours, right? You don't have to adopt mine. I just wanted to give you mine,
Right.
Um,
Okay.
and you can just, the important thing is that a new mode of so the important thing only is that you are part of a local community.
Yeah.
These can be connected. You can be talking to the trees, whatever you want. But
Yeah.
that's the general framing. Yeah. So that's
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, sounds good. And I mean, when I get there, if I end up decoupling too much from local community, pull me back in, please.
I will. Yeah. So
I know
I
you
will
will.
I will ask questions when I want to understand something better, or when I think you should give more context, and
Okay.
also when I think I want to pull you back more to the center.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. So I'll give the intro, but before I do that, I think also you had posed some questions at the beginning, and I think it might be useful that I repose in the way that I view the world. But it's
Mhm.
actually going to reconcile with all of your questions.
Okay.
And then from that, I'll dive into a bit of my background, and then really dive into some of the second part you described.
Okay.
So
I will keep myself muted for most parts, so not to interrupt here if things happen around me. Okay.
okay, sounds good. So you had asked questions like how do we organize a community, etc., when we are a bit more closer to nature, back to basics in a sense. How do we have, there's sort of many sensitive parts of this machine we call civilization right now. How do we address that better? Many other questions you asked. I think there's a unifying way to view this. Um, and the unifying way is actually going back to Maslow's hierarchy uh, and those levels there. So there's each level. The lowest level is simply um, uh, going for the basic needs, right? That's the first level of actualization of a human, is just meeting, food, clothing, shelter, water, right, if you will. And then one level up is things like health and education, achieving health, achieving education, maintaining that, growing, etc. And then as you go higher and higher up the levels, you get to the very top level, which is about self-actualization. Um, and this is so what does that mean? Well, it's up to you, right? Maybe your idea of self-actualization is writing the great American novel, or 10 of them, or maybe it's composing a wonderful piece of music, or maybe it's simply playing video games in your parents' basement, right? So it's really up to the person for the rest of your life, maybe, right? So it's really up to the person, whatever they're doing. And of course, it can mean changing the world in a big positive way, or negative, or whatever, right? Or amassing massive amounts of money. So that's sort of a set of goals, if you will, from the very basic needs to higher and higher levels. And normally this is framed as just for humans. But I think we can also frame it in terms of groups, to larger and larger groups, up to the level of civilization. So how do you make basic needs for civilization? And this was a lot of your questions before. And then what do you do about um, having sustainable health for all of civilization, all of people, and sustainable education? And to the higher and higher levels, how can a civilization self-actualize, right? And that's a really, really fun question to pursue as well, right? So those are the two dimensions, if you will. The dimension of going from basic needs all the way up to the level of self-actualization, and then the other dimension is going from the level of the human to broader and broader groups, family units, small companies, small organizations, NGOs, cities, and higher, ultimately to the level of humanity itself or civilization itself. So that's kind of the way that I think about this. And then as you'll hear, I'm trained as an engineer and I have a pretty analytical mind. So I really like to set goals like this first, objectives and constraints, or target outcomes, to use the language of business, and then work backwards to try to figure out, okay, what is the plan or the schedule to achieve these target outcomes, right? What resources do we have? How can we organize those in a set of tasks with the resources we have available to accomplish these goals? And of course, things change and stuff over time, and you can adapt, right? Just like a good agile process. So we can do this not just at the level of software design or family design, or even in an individual's life design, but we can also do this at the level of civilization design, putting together schedules, etc. So this is sort of the philosophy. Once you have the goals in mind, then you can start to apply philosophy and particular processes that were developed and used, that have been developed and used in engineering, in management, and otherwise, towards benefiting the planet. And so with that, I guess we have a new person here. Hi, Lars. Hello.
Lars?
I just didn't want it to disturb, so I took off my camera.
Okay, no worries.
Don't worry,
Meet you.
you're not disturbing. Maybe Lars, you want to give a small introduction for Trent to get to know you a little bit. So because Trent's going to go into his introduction in a minute, so maybe you take that time.
Yeah, I'll just do it very briefly. I come from business and studied philosophy, being the leader of the university students in Europe, which powered me into working with the Millennium Goals in the UN, was chair of the Future of Leadership Education, and have been part of creating some experimental educations like the CARES pilot, and founded in Norway something called Emergence, which was originally founded in South Africa. And it's based in core on that we have to build leadership training or change agents through personal leadership. So that's very brief.
Cool. Well, thank you, and a pleasure to meet you. And you'll,
You as well?
I guess. Go ahead.
Sorry?
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's it. And then you could put some things. I've been interested in Buddhism and lived like a monk, or done some substantial leadership training. So it's amazing listening to your project. Just ran through it briefly, so just continue, and then I'll just enjoy listening to you.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, to recap where I just started. Overall, I see that we can aim for self-actualization of individuals from by starting at basic needs and then going up Maslow's hierarchy, basic needs, then to the levels of education and health, all the way up to self-actualization. And we can do this not just for individuals, but also larger and larger groups, all the way up to the level of humanity itself. And sort of the eventual, then you arrive at how do self-actualization, how can civilization itself, humanity itself, self-actualize more fully? And so those are fun questions. And then towards answering it, and you can view those questions then, by the way, as objectives and constraints. I come from the world of engineering, where we have objectives and constraints, and then a design space to go across to achieve those. And in this case, a lot of it is actually a scheduling problem, where the design space is you have a bunch of resources and you have a bunch of tasks to do, and you can schedule those resources over time to accomplish the tasks. And by doing one task, you can unlock the next, you can unlock the next, and so on. It's a bit like, if you play a video game like Civilization or something, it's like a technology tree. But it's not just for technology, it's for other things too. Like, for example, if humanity achieved UBI, or even one country achieves UBI, that's a big unlock for humanity, because it opens the door to many other things. So anyway, that's a sort of a high level way I approach things. Self-actualization for individuals, all the way to the level of civilization itself. With that, I'll drill into sort of the two main questions that Thomas had asked, which is a bit more about me, and then a bit more about community building around sort of resilience, starting from a sort of nature 1.0 plus some basic tools. But I will be extending this towards a dimension of a nature 2.0 idea, because I've thought a lot about that, and ultimately towards self-actualization of civilization. And kind of with that, on the resilience side, I had before mentioned these objectives, objectives and constraints as sort of goals, the two main types of goals. But those can get wrapped within sort of a robust optimization way of thinking, where you can say, okay, meet these goals of, say, hit UBI with a 90% chance of hitting it if we do X or Y, Z, right? So everything is kind of probabilistic, and you can actually account for that when you are accomplishing this design. And I'll get into why I think about that so much. It's from some of my background and some of the work I've done in the past. Okay, so background. I was born and raised in rural Canada, Saskatchewan, Canada, to be precise, on a farm with pigs and grain. We had, and there's also, cattle and a few chickens and a horse here and there and a few other things, but mostly pigs and grain. And interestingly enough, my parents bought me a computer at a very young age, and this is like a TRS-80, so running Zilog Z80 processor. So you turn on the power button on, and there's a blinking cursor, And it's actually a command line prompt for using BASIC, GW BASIC, actually a version that Bill Gates himself implemented in the late 70s. My parents got that, and my brothers and I just, were like, what do you do with this? And we just started learning how to program it by reading the reference manual and trying to figure it out. No one taught us, we just had to figure it out on our own. But we were highly incentivized to, because, I was incentivized because I wanted to play video games, and we didn't have very much money. So the only way to play video games was to write our own. So we would buy, at first we would buy these books, like 10-page long, 20-page long books that each 2 pages would have a 100-line program, for example. So you type it in and run the thing. Don't even have a way to save it, but you learn how to program bit by bit by doing that sort of thing too. So I learned that at a young age, and was writing video games, and eventually made my own. At first, I would just change a string to say by such and such, by Joe X to by Trent McConaghy, and then I'm like, look, I wrote this game. But of course, I generalized over time and came up with my own ideas and so on. Grew up, working hard, playing hockey. It's rural Canada, super cold, all that. Shoveling pig manure, driving tractors, and programming computers, and also a heavy art aspect too, actually. But interestingly, and another thing that I reflected on, I only really realized a few years ago, that became really sort of very strongly imbued into my value system. Everywhere you went, this is rural Canada, we live near a city, population 6,000, but in Saskatchewan, Canada, if you have 6,000 or more people, you are officially a city. And so there was 2 grocery stores, and for the longest time, there's only one. And it was only possible because a whole bunch of the people living in the community, the city, and the broader community, and the farmers and stuff, got together and said, let's each pool a few $1,000s, and together with, collectively, we can construct this grocery store and get in all the food and the produce, and then sell it to the community. And that was officially a co-op called the Melfort Co-op, and a co-op as in, a cooperative, right? And it was a business where each year, there's, 10,000 members or something. Each year, everyone would get a small dividend from the profits, but it was only possible to do this. The only way you could get a grocery store was if you had a co-op. Similarly for the local bank, right? For the longest time, there's only one bank. It was a co-op, right? The Melfort Credit Union, and so on and so forth for many things. Most notably, my father, the farmer, my mother, the farmer. How do we sell the grain? Through the Saskatchewan wheat pool, once again. And it was a cooperative put together for the farmers to ship the grain to at local grain elevators, etc. Where then once you bring your grain there in the grain truck, it takes it away in trains to other cities in Canada and USA, as well as to ships. And then the ships would transport the grain to Japan and elsewhere and sell the grain. And there was, of course, marketing too. So they not just handled the intake of the grain from the farmers, but also distribution of the grain to elsewhere for processing into things like flour and final products, and the marketing thereof. So this was very important, So in my whole livelihood growing up, everything, the money coming in and the money going out was basically co-op. And if you think about it, a co-op is a wonderful way to reconcile capitalism, making money and so on, with people working together. So, the incentives are aligned. And of course, my father, the farmer, my mother, the farmer, they had a farm and trying to, grow the number of land and stuff and so on, the amount of land. But at the same time, using these co-ops and interacting with those as well as sort of this broader ecosystem of what this mini civilization, Melfort, Saskatchewan, and everything around needed. So that's what life was like growing up, and I went through school K to 12 like that, in that environment, and went to university, studied at the local university for Saskatchewan, and did a degree in electrical engineering, and also another one in computer science. You could merge them and do them both in 5 years, so I did that. And all the way along, I was hacking, programming, all of that. But also had these, values from the co-ops, but also Saskatchewan in general was very good. Kind of if you don't cooperate, you freeze to death. It's that cold, right? It also happens to be the place where universal healthcare first came from in the early mid 60s with the person running the province at the time. So, a lot of other like really great values infused in me. That was just sort of, part of the water supply, if you will. So did university. I started hacking on AI for fun because I thought it was cool. And from that led to getting a job with the government of Canada, doing AI as summer jobs, which to me, I just couldn't believe my luck that people would actually pay me to do AI hacking and stuff. So I was doing that as well as summer jobs. published in my first conference, etc. And then from that, this was then 1997, 98. The dot-com boom was taking off. And, we saw these startups just growing and, wired religiously all of this. And we said, you know what, let's do a startup too. And me and some friends explored many possible startups and then startup ideas. And then we went for one, which was looking at some people were using AI to design analog circuits. So in particular, a professor out of Stanford named John Koza. We looked at it, we thought, okay, maybe we can do better than that. I made a point of meeting John Koza, talking to him. He said, I'm not an electrical engineer, I'm just doing this. So we said, we can do better. It was taking him and his colleagues a month to run on a cluster of 1,000 machines at his house near Stanford. And actually, by the way, that was inspiration for Google's first data center too. But we thought, can we do it faster? So we aimed for that problem, aiming to do it faster because we were electrical engineers and we had background in AI. And we cracked it. We managed to make it run orders of magnitude faster, and we turned that into a company. And so we raised money, 1999, came out of undergrad, raised money with VCs and stuff like that, Intel and others. And then, built that up and changed the scope, pivoted and stuff as needed. And eventually the company got acquired five years later. So that was, a nice feather under my hat. We built something cool. People kept paying me to play with AI, which I loved. And I really saw that AI was a great lever for sort of, changing the world, but it was kind of still a bit fuzzy to me then, right? I'm early 20s, all that, things aren't that clear yet, but building a company was fun and all that too. From that, I did two things simultaneously. I kicked off a PhD at one of the top analog CAD groups in the world. So this is people using AI for designing chips, just like what I had done in my company. But now, towards getting a PhD and getting to know analog circuit design itself much better. I was an electrical engineer, but analog designers themselves tend to be trained with master's degrees and PhDs and really, really, really good at that. And analog circuits are circuits that are continuous in time or in value, just for background, as opposed to digital. So did that, as well as a second company, also in the analog CAD space, AI for designing computer chips, solving a different problem. So for the next several years, I did the PhD, and this second company also started the second company out of Saskatchewan, Canada. Once again, a rural place, but even back then we saw, hey, we can do this remote if we needed. Half our customers are in California. We can fly there as needed to serve them. And we did it, right? So we built that company up. And by the time the company was acquired several years later, 19 of the top 20 semis were customers. TSMC, which manufactures more than half the chips in the world and is a big driver of Moore's Law, was using it to help design the next generation of Moore's Law chips, transistors. So we were very proud of that, as well as, many others, Qualcomm, Sony, NVIDIA, et cetera, et cetera. So, we really hit it, really proud of that work. And once again, people were paying me to play with AI and also, AI that can have a big positive impact in the world. And it really, for me, fortified that, a key part of having a big impact in the world, or one really big lever, is Moore's Law. The sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that's been going on more than 50 years. If you build it, they will come. The area taken up by a transistor divides by 2 roughly every 18 months. And it's been slowing down just a little bit in the last few years. But the economic gains are still, things are doubling at higher levels. And kind of one thing I learned reading Ray Kurzweil and others is there's sort of the silicon Midas touch. Anything that silicon touches, it gets its own exponential. Things like gene sequencing was very, very slow until it touched silicon. And then suddenly it went on a much more extreme exponential and led us to, super cheap DNA sequencing that we see now. So that's a bit of my bio. And then finally, just to wrap this part up, in 2013, 2014, I started getting super interested in blockchains. I mean, I discovered in Bitcoin in 2010 and stuff, but 2013, I really got to blockchain finally. And with that, I started hacking and playing around, and it eventually led me to doing a startup and going full time in blockchain. First of all, for IP on the blockchain, focusing on digital art, and then pivoting towards really focusing on AI and data. And that's really what Ocean Protocol is about. And that's what I've been working on the last few years, which is Ocean Protocol, which uses blockchain to unlock data for AI. Why? Because a lot of society has been getting a lot more centralized. These large tech giants, et cetera, and they have these crazy monopolies because they have these giant data monopolies. So they get a sort of an overall consumer level monopoly almost by having just holding all of our data and sort of playing this game where they are controlling it, et cetera. And we don't want to be deplatformed the way that Trump was last week. You know, we kind of just go along with it. The idea of Ocean, so that was one side. That's sort of the negative side. The positive side is we see that, you know, to help unlock civilization, we really want to see that everyone has equal access to the data like this, with shades of gray control of privacy. You know, you should be able to have sovereign control of your own data, be able to monetize it, et cetera. Once again, this is from the level of individual, but also groups at higher and higher levels. You know, families, small companies, cities, national governments, enterprises, et cetera. Everyone should have, you know, sovereign control of their data and be able to give permissions to others as they see fit, towards benefits like monetizing otherwise. So that's kind of what Ocean is about. And our way to solve it is simply, well, give tools at the level of developers this control, but do it in a way where no one can own or control this. And to do that, you need blockchain, which is, you know, decentralized public utility networks. Think of it like the electric grid, or even better, the internet itself, TCP/IP protocols, but sort of one level up, right? Where it's this public utility where I can give permission to you to see my data. I can give permission to Facebook to see my data. Those permissions then are stored on this public substrate that no one controls. And at any given point, I can revoke permission as well, right? And, you know, people can build data marketplaces on top and other ways to have custody of the data, and so on and so forth. So that's really what Ocean is about, is, you know, to help unlock this new data economy that's open, permissionless, that levels the playing field for everyone. And I see it as a critical piece towards, you know, civilization going forward, given that we are in such a digital world now. You know, the digital economy is the data economy, to quote someone in the World Bank a couple years ago. So I'll stop there with the intro and see if there's questions or thoughts.
No, it's just a beautiful arch. I mean, you started with the sense of cooperation in Canada and in your childhood, and then going into all of the high tech and business, and now you're somehow merging these two. And I find it a beautiful arch. So it's yeah, nothing to add, nothing to ask.
Cool. Yeah.
Let's dive into the depth of the rest of the
Sounds good.
conversation.
Sure.
The other questions.
Yeah. So with this, on the questions, right? Like, I think the questions you had posed initially, you know, and a lot of the idea of Game B, there's different ways to frame it, but one of them is, you know, what if civilization goes kaput? Then how do we reboot ourselves, right? And so that's sort of one way of framing it. But there's or also, how do we exit to a different operating system or a different process for civilization, given that we perceive that the current one is broken, right? And I'm just putting, you know, I'm not saying that myself is my belief. That's just a way of asking the question, right? Of sort of Game Bers. And I'm very sympathetic to the Game Bers out there and what they're aiming for. And there's other ways to frame it too. You know, I'm close friends with some of them, and I think it's really, really healthy. I would posit it as also, and maybe this is a Game B way of framing, maybe not, which is, how can civilization self-actualize, including being robust to potential massive failure modes that happen in the near term, right? So so rather than saying we need to reboot to, you know, only Nature 1.0 plus a few basic tools like houses and stuff, can we leverage, you know, the other amazing stuff that has got invented in the last, you know, 50 years since the transistor, or the last 250 years since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, right? In a big way, right? And can we do it quickly in order to make ourselves robust to these massive failure modes, right? And that's, you know, kind of a parallel question to ask. And another one is, rather than sort of saying, okay, I'm going to build a completely parallel system, also, are there other ways to sort of slowly build a second system that maybe has thicker bridges to that existing system, but without sort of, you know, paying too much adherence to keeping the existing system happy, right? So there's sort of different levels of exit. It can be a hard cutoff, but it can also be a bridge, right? And if you think about like exit in the past, when we had humans come over to North America with the First Nations people, tens of thousands of years ago by the looks of it. And then again with the Vikings, but then really the next, from Columbus onwards, that was sort of this wave of Western Europe starting to settle North America in a big way, and South America. And who were those people settling? South America was the Spanish looking to get rich off gold, right? But North America, there was a bit of an attempt to try to like have new control and stuff, but it was really mostly people in search of a better life. But in other words, it's people in search of exit from the existing civilization, which wasn't treating them so well. So they went to the frontier, and frontier is a very, very useful word for this, right? The frontier in this case was a whole new massive land area which hadn't been taken over, which hadn't been exploited, right? South America was already getting exploited like crazy by the Spanish and stuff, but North America, it was colder, it was harder to exploit, and it was much more sparsely populated, right? So it was harder to exploit that way. And this is where like books talk about this in detail, right? Like How Nations Fail and otherwise, great books. So with that, right, these people that looking for a better life, they simply exited and they settled in places like New Hampshire and otherwise, the Northeast USA mostly at first. And then when that got more settled, and some of them didn't like that even. So they're like, okay, they exited more and they kept going west. Go west, young man, go west. And they kept going west for the next 100 years, right? Until civilization, fleshed itself out through all of North America too, right? Ending in California, and then even further so ending in Canada, right? So Saskatchewan, where I come from, only really got settled in about 1900 to 1910, was when Saskatchewan officially became a province, and a lot of these other institutions were formed, right? And that's kind of when the railroad came through and got more fleshed out, right? So only about 100 years ago, finally, right? So it's pretty recent. So the idea of, but if you think about this exit still had bridges to the existing civilization. It wasn't a hard cutoff, right? And they used the tools from the existing civilization that they, right? And so then the question is, okay, how can we create alternative civilizations that potentially have big bridges to the existing ones, but have enough freedom, enough sovereignty at the level of individual and higher groups, but critically, actually, leverage existing technology and processes, right? And I view governance as a technology as well, right? Such that we can and do it in a way, straight out from the outset, it gives us a degree of resilience in case the existing civilization fails really quickly. But if it doesn't fail really quickly, if it fails, maybe 30 or 50 or 70 years from now, then, maybe we'll have exited to Mars also. That's a nice backup. But there's other exits too, right? The challenge is after Mars, the next closest sustainable body might be, Alpha Centauri, which is like 40,000 light years away or something crazy, right? So we could build a civilizational starship to go, to fly for generation upon generation, or we could think of other ways too, where we aren't relying on our meat bag selves to fly as starships. So there's a lot of directions we can go on this, but I just wanted to start with that, saying, we don't necessarily have to constrain ourselves to just Nature 1.0 plus a bunch of tools that were invented 500 years ago. We can all instead say, how do we get robust in terms of massive civilization level, but also lower levels, right? Another point of sensitivity we have right now actually is semiconductors, actually, right? TSMC manufactures half the chips in the world. That's in Taiwan, right? And Taiwan is becoming increasingly sensitive. China's making big moves. So that to me is, a very scary thing as we head into the next 1 year and 5 years, right? So I'll stop there. And I'm happy to expand on many, many directions. I guess I should also just briefly mention, I mentioned it before, I'll just repeat it here. One cool philosophy for all this is we can make systems that are far more robust by leveraging a lot of the ideas of Nature 1.0 into what I call Nature 2.0, where Nature 1.0 is a substrate, an infrastructure for civilization, but we can actually now have new pieces of technology that look and act a lot more like trees, but they happen to have silicon and steel in them. And we can do this, they can be self-owning and self-replicating and so on, so that, easily considered life forms at the level of, a tree, or also higher levels like forests and so on. We can do that with self-driving cars that are also self-owning, and swarms of self-driving, self-owning cars. And same thing with roads and power grids and the internet itself and so on. So I'll stop there.
I just want to re-emphasize something you said in the beginning, which is about the self-actualization of society or even humanity, because I think that's an amazing fitness function to ensure that the underlying levels have to be in place and stable and resilient or anti-fragile. So aiming for that is totally feasible, because to me it's a proxy to getting everything right on the path towards there.
Yep.
Nevertheless, there's we're dealing with nature 1.0. We're dealing with humans, and where we need to. So humans, in the most basic sense, they need to eat something. They need to sleep in a safe environment. They need to be able to exist in a temperature range that is very small. So when you, in very practical terms, put yourself into a position where you're, let's say, because you're familiar with the landscape and necessities, and you've described immensely cold winters of your childhood to me in another conversation. So imagine you're back there, and you want to build the best possible community, let's say the seed of that mode of civilization, that civilization design that then can move towards all of humanity self-actualizing. What are the most important design elements and patterns that you see there, that you would like to bring in there as a member of that community?
I think it's a great question. Ultimately, I see it as whatever helps you to survive and propagate from an evolutionary standpoint. So kind of, in a lot of the AI work I did, I worked with evolutionary computation, so evolving computer programs, evolving analog circuits, and all of this. And as I, worked on that, I spent a lot of time reading about evolution and how models of evolution that originated, with biology, with Darwin, et cetera, found their way into massively influencing other fields, right? And so now, we have, evolutionary biology and evolutionary neuroscience and all these, and an evolutionary perspective on even business, right? Like, capitalism, in a sense, is an evolutionary perspective on business. So things that aren't working simply die out. You don't even need to reward the most fit from the middle fit. You just have to kill off the least fit, right? And that's exactly what evolution does. And that's enough sort of selection pressure to keep going. So then from a sort of culture perspective, in a town of 1,000 or 6,000 people, let's say you're an isolated community, how do you keep that community from not dying out, right? And what are the so you can have two communities side by side. One community, like maybe they're 100 miles from each other, 100 kilometers, I should say. One community ends up with, they have their own hypotheses of what works, and a second community, second community has their own hypothesis. So two communities, A and B. A picks hypotheses around what can work, and that becomes part of their culture, right? And they have their own maybe laws, and they have family gatherings and so on. And those, for whatever reason, they make a mistake and it doesn't work. Like it just doesn't work. Whereas community B, it works, right? So community B, they do well. So they make a new community 50 years later down the road, and then that works. And maybe community C is a part derived from B, and 50 years later another one down the road, community D. And then 500 years we've got community B, C, D, E, F, and these are all variants of this one community, this first community that had found a way to survive, right? So then you can ask, okay, what are going to be the cultural elements that allow it to survive and thrive, right? Or at least survive and not die. So among the ones that really work, interestingly, you can look at world religions. Some of the world religions, the unifying characteristics. So something that gives people hope is helpful. Something that encourages self-reliance is helpful. Something that encourages education is helpful. And a few other things. And in the past too, you know, getting past scary stuff, right? So faiths believing in some greater power was helpful in the past. If there's other ways to sort of realize where you can get hope, then you don't need that as much. But, you know, ways for people to have hope, to be inspired, to go forward and so on, right? I think that's really important. So to your question then, I took a long-winded answer to this, but ultimately, you know, I have partial answers to your question, but the ultimate arbiter will be evolution itself. And the partial answers are, you know, to me, this self, you know, reliance on oneself, personal responsibility, but then going to the group level of a small unit, you know, 5 to 20 people and different groups that an individual is part of, and then towards, you know, larger groups yet and larger groups yet, right? Organized in this sort of loose hierarchy where, you know, the members of a hierarchy, you know, you remember if you have high communication rate among those people in that hierarchy, right? That's the best definition of hierarchy in my view, is, you know, you're in a group if you have high communication with others in that group. And that's, you know, to yourself, you have super high communication to yourself inside your brain. And then, you know, towards the people around you, the small, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, and that's an incomplete list. I acknowledge it. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on that, but, you know, at the end of the day, evolution wins the day.
So I like that. I really like that image of structuring the working groups of a society, of a community like that, or raising the conscious level of who works together by measuring who communicates a lot. I think that's a very helpful notion. You trust evolution a lot, and you've built 2 companies that use evolution to solve to solve engineering problems. And in a sense, a community like that can be viewed as an engineering problem. You looked at it in a way very similar. How can you optimize and speed up that process in order to be sure that, or be more sure than just leaving it up to random try and error, that this community has the potential to survive?
So ultimately, actually, random try and error is fully random is the most robust search strategy out there, right? Once you go away from random, then you can get stuck in local minima and potentially even die off. But so that's just a sort of an aside to mention. But you can, if you think about the processes that is of evolution, then you can attach a design process around that, actually. And so designers of evolutionary algorithms are really interesting people because they're basically trying to come up with a set of very local rules and actions that any individual should be following, and the selection process around what those individuals do. But at the end of the day, they want some sort of global result, right? Some sort of set of individuals, or even an individual that achieves some outcome. But they're only able to set up they're only able to set up the rules of the system and then let the thing play out, you know, from one generation to the next to the next. So each generation, you know, you have a random population of say 1,000 individuals, and then you only you kill off the worst 500 in each generation. Worst according to, you know, how you know, did they feed themselves? If they didn't feed themselves, they're dead, etc. Right? If they can't run fast enough, they're dead. And if you do this, even after 5 or 10 generations, you're going to end up with something relatively fit, interestingly. But you need to keep introducing new elements of randomness, otherwise you'll. So you know, you kill off the worst, and then you have 500 individuals. How do you get new? How do you increase your population to 1,000 again? So you know, you have parent 1 mating with parent 2 to make a new baby, and that's crossover in evolution land. And that's sort of an interpolation. You can also have random mutations of one individual to the next, but you can also just randomly sample a whole new individual. And usually those die, but now and then it's really useful, right? And so that can be helpful. And there's other sort of variants of this, where, for example, you have kindergartners only competing with kindergartners, grade 1s only competing with grade 1s, and so on and so forth. And the sort of this age-layered competitive approach. So I just wanted to mention this because people who design AI evolutionary algorithms have to think about how to harness evolutionary processes to achieve a goal. It's another word for this is, this is very, very close to the ideas of complexity theory, which is also, where a lot of the Game B folks come realm play in and stuff, right? And complexity theory and evolutionary algorithms have a massive overlap in terms of fields. And the idea of a complex system versus a complicated system, a complex system has a small number of very simple rules, but then you sort of turn the crank, and you can end up with very complicated behavior. That's a complex system. A complicated system might have a large number of parts, but they actually might be well engineered, and often they're hierarchically organized. So each piece in the hierarchy might only have 7 or 20 parts, but then 7 or 20 parts of part A like combines to make part A, and then you have another part B, part C, and part D, and you combine those to make bigger and bigger parts. So you can make an automobile in the end, which might have millions of parts, but engineers designed it and things worked well together. So that's kind of the difference between complicated and complex. Now, here's the cool thing. You can engineer complex systems to a degree if you have some understanding of how these processes of emergence work. And there's a lot of great studies on this. This is where evolutionary computation comes in well, because, how do you design a better evolutionary algorithm, EA? Well, you have to think about this. And there's really great theories over the years about, generating new building blocks and mixing building blocks towards, better convergence. And how do you have diversity maintenance to have robust search algorithms, and so on and so forth, right? How do you not get stuck even for running for long periods of time, right? And another example is you can bias towards fully novel search, this idea of novelty search. So there's this idea of, engineering of an engineering approach to design complex systems. And there's people outside of the evolutionary algorithm world too, that think about it, that are still in the complex systems world. And this is actually where, this ties into blockchain, because if you think about Bitcoin, for example, Bitcoin is a complex system. It's a very simple set of rules with a built-in objective function: maximize the security of the Bitcoin network. And what does that translate to in sort of practical implementation? It is maximize hash rate. And how does it do that? It pays people. Whoever is contributing to the security of the Bitcoin network by contributing to the hash rate gets paid in Bitcoin. So if I'm contributing 1% of the hash rate to Bitcoin, then the next time that Bitcoin network dispenses Bitcoins, I have a 1% chance of winning those, right? And so that's pretty cool. So people are getting paid to contribute to the Bitcoin network. That looks a lot. That actually is a complex system that has this emergent behavior. Now we have millions and millions of people that hold Bitcoins. We have tens of thousands of miners, people who are running Bitcoin nodes, looking for their piece of Bitcoin to try to earn Bitcoin for this. And yet at the same time, Bitcoin can be viewed as its own new life form, right? Because it actually has a lot of the characteristics of life forms. It's a sort of a new piece of nature, if you will. You can't kill it anymore, right? It's out there. It's just sort of like, mosquitoes. It's going to be pretty hard to kill off all of the mosquitoes of the world, right? Or even coronavirus. It's probably with us for the rest of civilization, just like Spanish flu stuck with us for the rest of civilization since 1918, right? That's the annual flu virus flowing around, right? That's Spanish flu. Sorry, guys. So coronavirus is with us for life. Good thing we have vaccines to help keep it at bay, though. So to summarize, if you take an engineering approach to design of blockchains like Bitcoin and then Ethereum and otherwise, this is what you call token engineering, right? Design of processes of these complex systems to do other stuff. So, and I spent a lot of time on that. You probably know I coined the term even, but the point is you can have an engineering approach to design complex systems with emergent behavior. And that's exactly the questions you've been asking now, right? What small set of rules or values or biases can we have such that we have this emergent effect of initially just a small town, but hopefully grows and grows and grows to many towns, et cetera, to have a whole new civilization, right? So that is a complex design problem. And we have lots of great examples now in token engineering space, from evolutionary algorithm space and otherwise.
I want to bridge that into the human space. So you are not only able of thinking those abstract thoughts and engineering your way towards enormous solutions, but you also are capable of somehow motivating, aligning enough humans around that process to make it happen, because you can't make it happen alone. which means you need to somehow, with your group of people that you're forming this community with, agree on a fitness function and agree on the basic set of rules. And so what would that look like if you were in charge of the community? How would you go about it?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. To quote Charlie Munger, who worked closely with Warren Buffett for many, many years, show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome, right? And the incentives come in two forms, explicit and implicit. Sorry, I got that wrong. Extrinsic and intrinsic. My brain always confuses those. So extrinsic is like I described for Bitcoin, right? You literally get paid in Bitcoins. You can expect to get paid in Bitcoins if you contribute to the Bitcoin hash rate, right? Intrinsic would be, you think Bitcoin is really cool. Maybe you don't even own any Bitcoin, but you are going to go and promote it to a bunch of people because you think it's useful for civilization. So you could say that's an intrinsic incentive, maybe because you just like to, you care about civilization, or you could even call it a broader extrinsic incentive in that you want to live in a positive future, right? So it depends how you frame it, but it's definitely not an extrinsic incentive that's sort of right in front of your face at the tactical level. So then, towards your question, if you're trying to design one of these communities, what are potential extrinsic and intrinsic incentives that you can come up with, right? So extrinsic are, actual, and by the way, with incentives, there's always carrots and sticks. You can have positive ones, negative ones, right? And these so there's sort of this quadrant, extrinsic versus intrinsic, and carrot versus stick. So the most powerful ones, and you try to this is what you want to maximize. It's just like max out. It's just really hard to do, is the intrinsic carrots, right? So, so like you want to instill in, in children, in my children, etc., a love of learning where they get really, really positive benefit just by learning, right? They love to learn. So you try to imbue those values at an early age, by reading to them, by, you know that they, physiologically love to be near their parents, they love hugs. So there's a lot of tactics around sort of, how do you teach people intrinsic incentives? This is what a lot of good education is about. When you're studying to be a teacher, you learn about tactics like this. If you're, reading about being a parent, you learn about tactics like this, where, how do you inspire your child to become their best self, right? And almost sadly, it's not as common outside of sort of teaching children, whether as parents or as a teacher, but there is other stuff. This is sort of where, you see this in company motivational stuff sometimes, but usually, well, no, I shouldn't say usually, sometimes it feels very wooden and inauthentic. So, you'll want to arrive at authentic ways to improve and stuff too. But I think that's the core, is if you can inspire people to be their better selves, to improve themselves, to improve others, right? That's the best, because that's an intrinsic incentive and it's a carrot. You can also have an intrinsic incentive of a stick. Good example is, do you not want to die in a year or 5 years or 10 years? Or, do you want to, not feel bad about yourself? And it's, so like dying as in, Saskatchewan, where I grew up, right? 100 years ago, when it was still getting settled in a big way, if people didn't get together and form these co-ops, then they would have all died. So there was this intrinsic incentive to not die. That was then the stick. But the carrot was an intrinsic incentive to build a better future for themselves, as well as their children and their grandchildren, like me.
And I can see you doing that with your children, but how do you do that in a group of people that aren't your children, that you're not going to cuddle into learning, wanting to learn?
Well, I think it's, talking it over, right? Like, what's the shared vision? Where do you want to be in 10 years, and then circle backwards in 5 years, in 2 years, in 1 year, in 3 months, in 1 month, next week, tomorrow, right? And so, you have this inspiring vision of 5 years or 1 year from now that everyone gets on board on, right? You don't just sort of lay it down, this is the way. You talk it over, and you have a back and forth, and you have a real conversation about it. And maybe it's evolving, right? But together you have that vision that you've talked about, that you have clarity of vision together. And clarity is really, really critical, right? If you never have clarity, then you end up with, demotivated people. This works for, companies and blockchain ecosystems and ecosystems generally, but it also works for families and otherwise, right? And part of the clarity might be simply that we're going to iterate, right? Maybe we don't know what we want in 5 years or 1 year, except for maybe we want to grow, or we want to have, 1,000 people, or maybe we just want to, live and survive, right? Whatever that is. And there can be multiple goals. That's okay. So shared vision, clarity of vision, is probably the most important thing. And then that couples with a culture of personal responsibility, right? And because, once you have that vision, that clarity of vision, you have to accomplish it together. But if there's some people that just, in the group that you're putting together, if they're not pulling their weight, then it's going to be, then it's just a drain on the whole system and stuff, right? And of course, if you're children and stuff, that's fine. But later on, it's just going to be harmful. And this is where different societies have evolved different rules around that. Some of them are very, very open. They let, there to be drags, and other times they don't, right? And of course, even if you have sort of a society that gives opportunity, equal opportunity, which to me is a really great society, you're going to have unequal outcome, right? Because people have different skills. So and if you're in a very basic hunter-gatherer society, there's only a few skills that really matter, right? Like hunting and gathering. And of course, other stuff too, like cooking and caring with children, but there's not, the number of skills total is not that high. So maybe there's going to be some people that just are kind of bad at everything, right? So maybe but there's a few things where, just caring matters. But as your society gets, more advanced with technology, then there's more opportunity for people to specialize and leverage what they're truly good at. And that's another thing towards sort of, self-actualization. I think in general, people are, motivated if they, feel that there's clarity of vision, they feel that they can have an impact, they feel like they're moving towards, the pinnacle of Maslow's hierarchy, self-actualization. But they can't get there if they can't feed themselves, right? Like, there's, and you can't get there if you're not healthy, the second level up, if you don't feel like you have, that enough. So, a prerequisite to the top of the Maslow's pyramid is getting past the very bottom, and getting past the second level rung, and so on. So you got to climb the ladder, right? So maybe that will summarize, right? Ultimately, yeah. Even in this, small group, you want to go for self-actualization, but then the key heuristics are, shared vision with clarity of where you want to go, in the longer term, but also the medium term and the short term. Acceptance of personal responsibility, but then also responsibility as a group, etc. And then, just talking about it, communicating and so on, understanding that helps towards clarity, etc. Right? And I don't know, maybe I'm missing things, but I don't think you need that much more. Everything else kind of emerges from these basic things, right? And there's quite a few different sort of governance designs that implement this, right? Like, having centralized leadership, it can be very useful. Depending on what the transfer of power is, if it's more towards merit as opposed to family lines, and that's why, as an example, that's an argument why China is doing better now than Soviet Union did, right? But who knows? Will that survive? We don't know, right? But democracy moves more slowly, but also sometimes democracy isn't the way necessarily either, right? It is about equal opportunity across the board. And then from that, there's a bunch of different designs, right? And what's the best can change depending on the scale of the group.
So you're putting a goal, a vision, a shared vision far out for your community. Maybe even coming or defined by a central group, but definitely as a then deliberated on within the group. So that's what I understand as the beginning. It could even be the overarching fitness function of achieving self-actualization on species level.
Yeah. And I think, like, you need a centralized element to start with. I think there's examples out there, both directions. So in blockchain, right, every project basically was centralized to start, right? Satoshi wrote the first implementation of Bitcoin, put it out there, or actually Satoshi with someone else. iterated with someone else, and they put it out there, and then there was a small number of developers improving it, and even to this day, it's just a small number of developers improving it, actually. And there's sort of a meritocracy for getting in to become another developer. But then there's other, concentric spheres of broader and broader ways of participating in the Bitcoin community ecosystem. So that's an example of centralized. Going back a bit further, most open source software is like that, where there was one person who laid out the initial thing, but then over time it became more and more open. Linux is like that. Python is like that. Unix is like that, etc. But then, you might ask, well, are there examples where it was sort of decentralized from day one? And you can think like, human civilization was kind of like that, right? Where, well, it's actually tough to say where there was evolution, but then species evolve and so on. But evolution itself isn't saying you needed to have some sort of tight centralized group to start with, but the nature of a species within evolution, something that can breed with something else, necessitates this idea that at the beginning there's just a small number of individuals, right? And it might grow exponentially, but to start with, it starts with a community of one or two, right?
But if you let's stick with the open source communities as an example. So there might be, they evolve out of a specific context in a specific time with specific resources, etc. And then through their success, maybe they start changing all of these environmental variables, which means that at one point they might run into a situation where they either fundamentally have to reinvent what they've built in the first place, or they will be overtaken by somebody else. And being overtaken by somebody else as a community is always a bad thing. So this reinvention, self-reinvention mechanism or self-evaluation of, are we on the right path? Are we doing the right thing? And are we allowed to kill stuff that we've fallen in love with because it's inherent to our culture now? In what you're describing, in my understanding, must be baked into the system somehow.
So I like your question, and I agree with almost everything you said, except for this assumption that it's the initial group that needs to be the group that survives. So you need forking is a form of exit, and you always need optionality to exit, right? So if that initial setup by, say, an open source developer wasn't so good or wasn't very evolutionary fit, there, maybe someone will fork it, and you end up with maybe something much more successful. A good example of that is Firefox. So, when Netscape was in the process of being acquired, amazingly, the Netscape team managed to get that code out in the open source as the Mozilla browser, but no one was using it. It was super complicated. The code base was complicated, all this. And along comes a developer, just a guy out of nowhere, basically a young guy. He forks the code base, massively simplifies its usability, like makes it much more usable, massively simplifies it. And that thing just takes off especially in comparison to Mozilla, right? And then the rest of, to the great credit of the Mozilla Foundation, they recognized this and they embraced it, right? So then they kind of reforked in. Another good example on something on protocol level is with, I think it was HTML5. So there was, anyway, one of the versions of HTML, there was this big effort to make it this whole new version, and it was getting unwieldy and complex. So there was a splinter group that forked off, did their own thing, and that ended up working really well. And then the World Wide Web Consortium ended up pulling that back in as the main thing. For a while, there was a separate consortium called What3Web, I believe. So there's lots of examples of that. But yeah, forking is a form of governance in the form of exit. It's really, really important, right? One final one, 0MQ, is, initially had two main core developers, two founders. And at some point, they got to a critical point. One of the founders said, community is more important. The other founder said, the product itself is more important. And if we do this centralized, then we can move faster. So they forked. They basically split. They bifurcated. One didn't really fork. It was more of a bifurcation. One went for community. One went for faster. And for the first 6 months, the centralized fork went faster, but after that, bit by bit, but the community came back with a vengeance, right? The community won, and that one was led by Peter Hinchins, and he even wrote a book about his experience in that. And he had a lot of great philosophy on sort of open source projects, right? So over the long run, bottom up community always wins, thanks to the exponential, right? But over the short run, centralized, it can be useful, and forking is a really, really great governance tool.
So, trying to tie it back into that community, where maybe a group of 10 people see that there could be a better way to do some things, and as part of the culture, they're allowed to just split off for a year or two and test that assumption. And if they're successful, they can fork back in.
Yeah, fork back in, or just build their own community, right? So, and of course,
Yeah,
there should be less heavy ways to try to give feedback on the governance to start with, right? Because you don't want, if you end up with every time someone has a grievance, they fork away, you end up with no one, right? So you should be able to have more lightweight governance for getting feedback, for updating yourself without resorting to sort of a very, very heavy thing like forking. And we're even seeing this in blockchain protocols, right? Where there's on-chain governance for sort of the near-term decisions and stuff, the slower moving, the faster moving things, especially the less controversial things. But for the larger things, ultimately, you might need a fork. And there's other examples too. The innovator's dilemma is this idea, but where how do big corporations innovate, right? Because if you're a really inventive person in the corporation, you come up with a new idea of something, but maybe the corporation itself is too big and heavy to like understand that it's important at all. A good example is Nortel. A friend of mine was an advisor to the VPs, and he brought them Skype back in like 2001 and said, hey, this thing is going to eat the telephone system, right? You guys should be aware. Nortel was, a big tech darling in Canada at the time, multi-billion dollars in revenue. And they said, we're not even going to look at things until they have $1 billion in revenue. And Skype, had no revenue at the time. Their usage base was growing like crazy. It had just come out. But, 5 years later, Nortel was dead. And, Skype, went on to, I don't know, hundreds of millions of users and had a huge impact on telephony in general, right? But the innovator's dilemma said, how you solve it is, one way to solve it is create a small spin-off company where that team is sufficiently incentivized to do their own thing, and then let it grow on its own. The big company can have invested in it so that they have a stake in the game. And then eventually that big company could reacquire that small company if they want, right? Or maybe that small company gets acquired by a competitor, right? But the point is, it's sort of also forking, right? And so similar things in this community, right? Looping back to this community of 100 or 1,000 people or even 10, you want to have greater and greater levels of escalation where they are on longer and longer timescales for greater and greater sort of pain, right? And the timescale thing is really interesting. This is something that a lot of people don't think about, but Stuart Brand and Danny Hillis wrote about it in the Book of the Long Now, where you basically want, for the stuff that is, small changes, small deltas, you want to have a very lightweight process that can be very fast, right? But then for things that, on the opposite extreme, for things that like have massive impact, massive change, you really want the time scale for that to be much longer, months or even years, right? So one thing might be, changing one line in a piece of software that hardly anyone uses, and the other one might be, an amendment to the American Constitution, right? And there's shades of gray in between, right? So I think that's really useful that, and I think, in Stuart Brand and Danny Hillis, they gave 6 timescales where things like culture move really, really quickly, whereas governance at the, government level move really, really slowly. And even more slowly is things like, natural bodies, right? All that. I think it's a really useful heuristic.
That reminds me of another group of people actually in Canada, indigenous people. I keep forgetting the somewhat unspeakable name, but they have this notion of 7 generations, being the steward for the future generations, and they think 7 generations into the future. And I was thinking about that when you were describing the notion of using the ideas of evolutionary algorithms, and the question of could that be turned into like a game or a tool, very easy to use tool, not even in a computer, not even digitally, but just play through a number of evolutions, a number of generations, to understand or get an intuition, a shared intuition of where this is going to end. Any type of decision. So to broaden that horizon. Do you know of something like that? Do you think that might be useful?
Yeah, I think it could be very useful. I know if you allow yourself to look at software, there's a bunch of games that sort of let you play with evolution and stuff, right?
Mm.
An interesting one that has is Black and White from 20 years ago now, and one of the lead developers of that, Dennis Hassabis, went on to co-found DeepMind, right? And it actually had creatures that were evolving. And now, though, if there's a lot of games out there. If you look closely, they have elements of evolution in various ways. In blockchain land, we had something called CryptoKitties that emerged a few years ago that has CryptoKitties having babies, and people were buying and trading that. And even on the App Store on Apple, you'll find games where there's sort of evolution happening, but you have to kind of look for it. So I don't have great examples right now, but there are ones out there. I'm sure if you just Google evolution game, you'll find some interesting ones. And there's many cool demos too, put up by especially computer scientists that are pretty neat. Now let's talk about non-computer stuff. That was your main question. In the token engineering community, there's a couple board games that people have done, which I think is pretty neat to help play for that. So if you Google token engineering board game, you'll find links to those. I forget the names offhand. Beyond that, part of this, there are examples. I've got wind of here and there. For example, there was a guy running Cadence, which was one of the top EDA companies, still is one of the top, and he was considered a really great leader. In fact, he was even they even considered using him to replace Steve Jobs in Apple when Steve was starting to get sick. And what he did he gathered together all the executives of Cadence, and they played a role-playing game where each of them pretended to be a specific company in the ecosystem. And then they took turns iterating on this sort of role-playing game. And it's sort of like, evolution meets capitalism meets role-playing, right? So that was pretty cool. And, if you think about it, then you generalize or just look at other places for board games, Dungeons and Dragons, Might and Magic, all those also have elements of that. I think all of these are cool. And there's probably other ones too, with sort of like self-help seminars and other things. If you look around, I'm sure there's other things like this. Is there something specifically well-tuned to your question? Not that I know of, but we're getting there. One thing that's inspirational, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, me and some friends were talking about there needs to be board games for token engineering, and now they're here, and they're getting used, and I love that, right? So so if we just did, there needs to be board games or human role-playing games or otherwise towards creating new communities to help people get a feel for this, then maybe that's enough to inspire some of the people out there.
It will, I'm sure. It already has. I've been locking you into the Nature 1.0 thing for long enough now. So I'd like to open, I don't know how much time you still have left, but I'd like to open this and let you run on this for the remainder of the time, to expand. If you were to embed all of what we've been saying into a future where we have all of the technology you could dream of, what would that start looking like?
So, I mean, to have all the technology we can dream of, and fast forward a billion years of civilization, then, I mean, everything is Dyson spheres, right? So, we're all patterns of intelligence floating in the universe, trying to reverse entropy. So, which is actually kind of that's if you turn the crank, that's what self-actualization of civilization actually means eventually, right? And a sort of grand scale. But you can even go beyond, right? So read Asimov or read Cixin Liu, and you'll see that you can even go crazier than that. But you know, and by the way, as an aside, science fiction is a really great way to get inspired about what things can look like, right?
Yeah.
Because they point to possible futures. They look at the positives, they look at the negatives, they look at balanced versions. I think that's really healthy, right? And you know, some of them look far into the future, some of them look near into the future. Some of them, some very special ones, actually start with the near future and then go farther and farther into the future, typically in accelerating timelines, such as Charlie Stross's Accelerando, which is a really fun novel. So things like that I think are really inspiring. So back to your question. So I'm not going to answer if we had all the technology, but instead, maybe what I can do is lay out some of the steps along the way that I think are really important and useful, sort of target outcomes that we want in terms of technology and governance that will help to bias civilization towards, you know, the rest of these wonderful outcomes eventually, right? Because if we're not careful, if we're not careful, we could end up, you know, rewinding progress 1,000 years or more, right? Or 10,000 years. Things like blowing ourselves up, right?
Yeah.
Right. So one of them is actually, I hinted at it before, it is UBI, actually, universal basic income. Once we do that, it helps to catalyze human self-actualization at the individual level, right? Because right now you have a whole bunch of people that, you know, for whatever circumstances they were raised in and stuff, or maybe even in their, you know, late teens, early 20s, they got themselves into a situation, or they found themselves in a situation where they were just focusing on sustaining themselves, right? You know, just, you know, feeding themselves, maybe feeding their family around them, right? Their wife, their kids, whatever. And they might end up in that treadmill their whole life. And you might think, well, that's, you know, really, that's sad. It kind of is. And unfortunately, it's a lot of people, right? And so, you know, it's probably the vast majority of humanity, in fact. So imagine if we can somehow remove the need for people to have to focus on just feeding themselves, you know, getting food, clothing, shelter, water, and instead, you know, having a bit more time to level the playing field of sort of opportunities towards, you know, at least getting health, better education, but ultimately self-actualization, right? Because that's ultimately what we want, is equalize the opportunity for self-actualization. So to get there, UBI is a really, really key piece because it gets at that bottom level, right? Universal basic income. So every single person on the planet, not just a country, not just a town or country, but every single person on the planet has an income that allows them to feed themselves, right? But the next thing is not just at the lowest level, but one level up, and eventually USI, universal self-actualization income. So every single person on the planet has the resources at their disposal, you know, sort of guaranteed by right or by, you know, by point of being in the civilization at that point in time, to chase their dreams, right? And dreams that are reasonable, right? Like if I dream of having a $1 trillion starship, well, sorry, that's not reasonable, right? But, you know, enough to chase most dreams, if you will, to a reasonable level. So, you know, writing the great American novel, writing some great software that changes things, you know, playing video games in your mom's basement, whatever, right? But, you know, so all those levels towards that, right? That's kind of where I'd love to go. So then you might ask, well, how do we pay for this, right? Because I really see that, you know, USI is a really, really great thing to aim for. So how do we pay for that? Work backwards. You might say, let's try to convince governments to pay for it, you know, one government at a time, right? And interestingly, you know, we almost got to UBI under the Nixon era. It actually went through the House, I think once at least, or maybe even twice, and then it stopped at the Senate, right? Politics have changed. We're starting to come back to it thanks to the likes of Andrew Yang and all that. So it's becoming more of a mainstream idea. That's great, right? But I don't think we should count on national governments doing this, right? And obviously we've seen other experiments elsewhere. If it happens, awesome, right? Let's nudge them. Let's make it really easy for them. Let's lower the friction for them to do it. But maybe there's other ways, you know. Is there some other way we can approach this by using other tools that can scale to civilization levels? And the answer is yes, right? If you look at Bitcoin, it has scaled to civilization level, right? It's now getting to sort of a value that's towards the order of magnitude of gold, right? It's seriously being considered by millions of people as another store of value. But not only that, it's, you know, a lever to help to reshape other things. So the point is, overall, it has got to a level of sort of it's a piece of our civilization already. It's a life form that isn't going away, right? So how is that? I mentioned before, incentives. Thousands, tens of thousands of people are incentivized to keep this thing going, right? And hundreds of thousands are incentivized to spread the word, right? Well, it doesn't stop at Bitcoin, right? You can design other incentive machines, blockchains, with incentives that can help towards other goals of civilization, including goals that can help towards USI, right? And my example here is, you can't just print, well, I was gonna say you can't just print money, but you actually can, and Bitcoin is kind of doing it, but it has a pro and a con. But it's gonna be hard to create a bunch of chains that are all competing for the store of value use case, right? Bitcoin's, doing super well on that, and it's probably one that we'll see. But if you can actually you can create a blockchain that has incentives, that creates value, and then uses the value, takes a cut of the value created and points it back towards USI, Universal Self-Actualization. Here's what this looks like. Imagine you have the city of Berlin, right? We both live in Berlin. The city of Berlin, it's got an Uber-like network, but you know how Uber has talked about self-driving cars. So it's all these cars are self-driving, so there's not actual drivers. But no worries, because they've all got themselves paid for it. Don't worry, Fed and stuff and USI. But imagine these cars are all driving around, and they're all automated, level 5 autonomous vehicles. But each car is its own corporation, right? It owns itself. And you might think, well, that is impossible. Shareholders own corporations. No, actually, they can own themselves. Bosch is a really great example. Multi-billion-dollar organization, but it's not a company held by shareholders. It basically owns itself, thanks to a particular legal structure that Germany has. Other countries have similar legal structures, right? So you have each car, it's its own corporation, just like a Bosch, but you don't, and you have that for car number 1 and car number 2 and so on, right? How did it get that? How did it begin owning itself initially? Well, Daimler or BMW or Tesla or whatever, they manufacture the car. And then they kick off this new corporation that owns the car, but as a lease, so that they give a loan to this first self-owning car of itself, and then it pays itself off in this Uber-like network over the next 5 years or 10 years, right? Uber has margins of 40 or 45%, right? So it can pay it for itself, pretty quickly, right? It doesn't have its own mouth to feed except for gasoline, which is much cheaper than a human, right? Or electric, which is even cheaper. So you do that. And by the way, electric will get super cheap when we get fusion. That's another, very nice step for civilization. I'll get to that in a bit. So basically you have this electric car that not only is self-driving, it's self-owning as a corporation, right? And it can, iterate. You might say, well, what about all the paperwork and all the other stuff to maintain that corporation? Well, of course, you don't even need a legal entity per se if you don't want. You can just go on blockchain, right? Every single smart contract on Ethereum is self-owning. It can hold its own tokens. It doesn't even have a private key because it holds them itself, right? So there's all these DAOs, et cetera, decentralized autonomous organizations. They just live on blockchains. A lot of them don't have an equivalent legal entity. They're just there, right? They're their own little mini life form, right? So you can have a legal entity or not, doesn't matter. It's partly administered. It's administered on the blockchain. It's running. You've got this blockchain then entity that's controlling the self-driving car that basically. Going back to Daimler then, if Daimler manufactures a thing, they get paid back in 5 years or 10 years. And they're totally incentivized to do this. Why? Because they're manufacturing their own customer. And you might think, well, would they be visionary enough to do that? Guess what? They already did. It's called Car2Go. Car2Go is Daimler manufacturing its own customer in the form of car sharing, ride sharing. So they said, hey, why don't we create, manufacture another 10,000 customers for ourselves? And we'll call it Car2Go, and it'll be a ride-sharing network. So it's very smart. They did that. So they can do it again. But in this case, it's for, this network of self-driving, self-owning cars, right? And they do all of Berlin. They create their own, each car is its own company. It's paid off over a number of years. Daimler has made itself a bunch of money. And in the end, these cars are self-driving, self-owning, great. But guess what? They're AIs. They don't really care how much money they own. So once they pay it off themselves, guess what we can do? We can funnel all of the surplus to USI. UBI to start, Universal Basic Income, but eventually USI, right? And what does that look like? It's actually really easy to implement. What you do is you just create a smart contract on the blockchain that says that has some sort of proof of unique human, right? And there's actually some good ones out there these days. Circles, UBI, which is also Berlin blockchain system for UBI, if you sign up, basically you get a basic income in a sense. It's a different way to approach basic income, but it's also a really, really great proof of unique human. They had to solve that problem because they wanted it to do basic income, right? So anyone can sign up for Circles UBI. With that, you get this decentralized approach to proving they're a unique human. So as soon as you've got that Circles identity, guess what? This self-driving car network can pass money to you. Every time a car takes in a ride, maybe let's say it makes 10 euros, right? Well, that 10 euros gets divided into, say, the 10,000 people, or I'll make it fun. The 10 people that have signed up to this UBI system to start with, they each get €1 on average, right? But then, of course, you can have a million people or a billion people, right? And maybe at first, each person's only getting a penny. But with time, it's a penny per ride, but that accumulates to maybe 10 euros a month, right? 10 euros a month won't move the needle for me. But guess what? It will move the needle to someone in rural Africa, or even some ambitious kid in rural Saskatchewan, rural Canada, right? And that's really cool. And bit by bit, though, we turn on a self-driving, self-owning car network in Berlin, and in Munich, and in Paris, and in London, and in San Francisco, and in New York, and every other city. And these things, they self-own, they replicate. The car manufacturers have all these new customers. They're happy about that. Just like people manufacturing computer chips for Bitcoin miners, same thing. And in the end, we now have universal self-actualization income, which is a really, really, really key constraint to unlock civilization for the future. It allows every single person to chase their dreams, to have the funding to do it, right? Working backwards then, one thing that would lower the cost of all of this is super, super cheap electricity, right? How do we get there? Solar is really helping, right? It's solar panels, they're silicon, right? So they've got their own Moore's law. And with that, the price has been dropping exponentially. Compare that to oil, where price has not been dropping exponentially because it's not touching silicon per se, right? So that's really great. And with just solar, we're in great shape. But we've even got something even better coming down the pipe, which is fusion. And now there's companies that are doing fusion, that are getting closer and closer to reality. They still got timescales of 10 years, 20 years, but that's not that far away in the timescale of civilization, right? That's very exciting to me. And it's really pragmatic approaches. Ultimately, fusion was just simply about solving an engineering problem. Actually, it hasn't been a mystery for a long time. It's really an engineering problem where you need a lot of pressure and a lot of heat and a couple other ingredients, and you put them together in just the right way, and you achieve it, right? And for years and years, tokamak was this only way, this sort of donut thing. But there's other approaches too that people have had, and that's really unlocked some new ideas, and new thinking, and new funding, right? So, but the cool thing is we're not dependent on fusion. Solar, is enough to unlock civilization energy needs for a long, long time in a big way, even as we exponentially grow our energy needs, And by unlocking super, super cheap energy, it means we can desalinate the ocean, so we have no problem with water, right? It means we can and do a bunch of other things. Basically, energy traditionally has been a big bottleneck for civilization. So between nearly free energy and USI, we're in great shape, right? But then to work backwards, right? A couple other things. Actually, I'm going to just talk about the Nature 2.0 side of this thing. Well, before I forget. Okay.
I think that is important because you touched upon several things, like, let's say, solar and many of the ingredients for solar are very extractive on the planet and on people. Desalinating the oceans, we won't desalinate the entire oceans, but that will cause its own problems.
Yeah, we don't need to desalinate, but we have no shortage of human water supply. That's the point.
But we need to be careful, and that's where Nature 2.0 comes in.
Yeah. So let's talk about what else Nature 2.0 means. So if you think about these cars, right? Let's actually go back to Nature 1.0 for a second. So a tree, right? It's kind of this thing. It has an interface to the world. It's made of about a bunch of cells, which are each their own amazing nanomachines that have their own interface to each other as cells to make this overall organism called a tree, and then a broad organization called a forest, et cetera, right? And they talk to each other too through roots and all this chemical processes, et cetera. But that tree, right? It doesn't really have sort of care in the way that humans care. It doesn't care about money, all that. But ultimately, what guide how it cares is simply evolution, right? It works. It makes babies, and the idea of a tree, the DNA in it, and all that doesn't die, right? So it's sort of just there. It takes in resources and then outputs new things. It manufactures wood, it manufactures oxygen from carbon dioxide, etc., which is cool, right? And that plays. It's a piece in this overall ecosystem, right? That we call nature 1.0. So trees interact with the soil, interact with the worms in the soil, interact with the rain, and the overall water cycle, et cetera, et cetera. And there's all these different sort of interlocking pieces that start at the super basic level, but we'll start at the tree level, and trees with other organisms at that level to higher and higher levels like forests and bigger ecosystems, which ultimately is Mother Earth, right? And even this concept we have of nature isn't even that old. It was actually first conceived of by a Berliner named Alexander von Humboldt, right? And then propagated with a lot of wonderful writing that he had, and others too that sort of riffed on it, that were poets and stuff, right? Which is actually really great though, because it helped people to reconcile that science. You could do science and learn about how mechanics of nature, but not compromise the beauty, right? Walden is a great person who showed the beauty of this, and it was anyway. Going on about Humboldt, he's one of my heroes. But anyway, so you've got trees, you've got these other things as well, the flora and the fauna and all this, and that's nature 1.0 working together. But nature 2.0 is the self-driving cars, each one on their own, equivalent of a tree, swarms of them, the equivalent of a forest. The roads they drive on, right? The equivalent of, the soil, if you will, or otherwise. And, a road can be self-owned as well. And it's also it can be its own life form, right? Where it's just charging a very small toll to the cars that are driving over it automatically and all this, and interacting with that system. And you can have the same thing with the power grids, self-owned, autonomous power generators, fusion plants, or solar panels or otherwise, as well as solar manufacturing capabilities, all of this, right? So bit by bit, we can have more and more of these self-owning autonomous entities, right? Call them AI DAOs if you want, artificial intelligence, decentralized autonomous organizations, or just autonomous self-owning entities. And when they start, they're going to be interfacing with each other and also interfacing with nature 1.0. And they're very similar in philosophy to nature 1.0, right? Because they're both about infrastructure for civilization that's just kind of there, right? We just take it for granted. It's kind of there, that's it. We're sort of taking the power grid for granted, but it's still run by mostly centralized entities. But once those become decentralized, they're just there, right? The internet itself is much more of its own life form already, simply because there's entities incentivized to run it, so it's sort of autonomous on its own. Same thing with Bitcoin on top of the internet. But these other pieces we can make more autonomous by basically using the tools of decentralization. So that's sort of nature 2.0, and you can view it as a group of technologies that collectively get built and rolled out, and in terms of governance, they're just really autonomous, right? And so that's a piece. And then towards, the back to the land thing and stuff, to me, it's, doesn't have to be back to the land. It's more like the land gets new functionality, right? And, nature itself isn't 100% benevolent, right? Lightning strikes and kills people. And there's other, we have tsunamis, we have floods, we have earthquakes, right? But overall, it's a really great substrate for civilization to proceed. Nature 2.0 will also be like that, right? If you're gonna rescind control fully, it really truly means giving up control, right? And that means that there's going to be negative things that happen now and then. But the positive, if we do a good job in setting up these complex systems and engineering these complex systems, then the positive will greatly outweigh the negative. So it will be out of control, to quote Kevin Kelly, but it will be, a beneficial upgrade of civilization's infrastructure. So that, like if civilization, if sort of we have sort of a collapse of the civilization that we know it, thanks to nuclear holocaust or something else, 10 years, 100 years from now, whatever, this will be resilient enough to get past it, hopefully, right? And that's the question, right? What I described, a lot of it, the internet, some of the people that were behind the internet did want were incentivized to make sure that it was that could survive nuclear fallout. Some people say the internet was built just for that. That's not quite true. But some of the people said yes towards funding development of the internet because of that, right? So it really was a piece of it. But same thing with Nature 2.0, right? Think of it like, yeah, surviving potential civilizational catastrophes by having super resilient systems, right? But we still need to fix a few things, right? Like I mentioned, like semiconductor manufacturing, right? We've got to re-decentralize that more, right? So, one really positive sign actually from the Trump administration, amazingly, was that they actually emphasized more funding of semiconductor fabs on American soil. So TSMC is going to be building a new fab on American soil. That's really, really good, right? Hopefully they're doubling down on Intel making things. Europe needs to regain its ability to do semiconductor manufacturing at scale. They've got really great technology and know-how, but they haven't put the billions they need back into that, right? And they can. IMAC out of Leuven in Belgium has the know-how, right? It can get scaled up again, and leveraging Siemens and others again, it's going to be really important because we don't want, we want to avoid, China conflict, Taiwan, USA, right? So I'll stop there. But on that, but then also I can mention a key thing, a prerequisite, before I stop actually, a prerequisite for Nature 2.0 at length is rolling out key infrastructure at the IT level on top of the internet that's fully decentralized, right? And so we need to decentralize in computing. There's three key pieces of computing, three pillars of computing. There's storage, communications, processing. So we need to decentralize those pillars and the middleware layers that sit on top of it. So the three pillars, we need to decentralize the storage. So right now, most of the storage that's happening is on the cloud, right? Now it turns out, TCP/IP, internet protocols, support higher levels. Same thing with the web, but we've been seeing this re-centralization towards data centers of Amazon and so on. So we have to go backwards. We have to go back to what's possible and decentralized storage. And the good thing is there's blockchain protocols, projects going for this. Filecoin, Arweave, Dia, and many others. So that's storage. But remember, there's three key elements. There's storage, communications, and processing. Communications, this is right now, right? TCP/IP packets are being shared sort of by routers in sort of very centralized-ish entities. Here in Germany, Deutsche Telekom is by far the biggest provider, right? What if, and they have very deep ties to the German government, given that they spun out of that, right? So, so can we bypass sort of centralized packet routing and deployment of internet service provisions, right? And the answer is yes, and it's happening in kind of two ways. In sort of the ISP route, with people having their own routers, sort of the Helium networks of the world, Althea, Skyline, and more, as well as at the sort of level of sort of decentralizing Tor and VPNs like Orchid Protocol and otherwise there, right? They're all kind of related, right? And that's really good. And the negative scenario we don't want is Elon Musk's project Skyline getting 99% market share, which could really happen, which is super dangerous because right now Elon seems to have somewhat centralizing tendencies. So I'd love to see that decentralized. So Elon, if you're listening, at least set it up to decentralize over time, right? But overall, the good thing is decentralization of communications, especially at the packet level, is really important. The third thing, decentralization of processing. There's sort of the sort of important contract level. So Ethereum was the first to do a great job on that. And then there's many other sort of networks that are, trying to improve upon Ethereum or become complementary. And this is things like, well, there's a bunch of sort of, they're often labeled would-be Ethereum killers. So those are the three big ones. But then also going back to communications, we really want to have a network of networks. Just like initially there was ARPANET, but it didn't quite scale. So how can we have a network of networks? And the cool thing is we do have a network of networks from a decentralization blockchain standpoint, and that's things like Polkadot and Cosmos. And I do want to mention, right, there's important pieces one level up. So a big one is data itself. So not just data storage, but who has what permissions, because we've seen big problems there, and that's where I'm involved. So Ocean Protocol is about unlocking data at the higher level, self-sovereign data, all that sort of thing, right? So it's making sure that each individual can control the data that they have, give permissions, rescind permissions, all of that, but not just at the level of individual, but also, higher and higher level groups, families, companies, enterprises, cities, and nations themselves. So those things, and there's many other pieces, but I'll just stop there. Those are pieces of IT infrastructure that we need to decentralize in order to truly make civilization resilient. If we really want to maintain all of these, not just, nuclear holocaust stuff, but not get into these traps of centralization that makes us super, super non-resilient, right? Like where it can cause breakage, right? So yeah, I will stop there though. I know you have things to say.
You went up several levels here, and I want to bring us down to the substrate level, because without the substrate level, all of that won't work. And you pointed towards most of the chips being produced in Taiwan. If that stuff goes south, or something else happens, we break the supply chains for the rare earths we need, that will just stop. So where does the substrate come from?
So I mean, yeah, with the chips themselves, right now the economics of semiconductors for to make these most modern chips, it does cost $10 billion plus to manufacture this thing using a lot of these different elements and stuff, right? So it's not something you can decentralize to 10,000 nodes, but at least you can decentralize to 3 or 4 regions, right? China, USA, Europe. But you still have this other constraint you mentioned, this other challenge of right now every single modern semiconductor chip sort of uses the whole periodic table worth of elements, right? And that was done basically as part of pursuit of driving Moore's law, right, to smaller transistors over the years. So how do we, get beyond that? And it's okay to use many elements from Moore's law, but if there's some elements that are used that only have, one place or 2 places where we can get it supplied, how do we get past that, right? So I don't have great answers. I have partial answers, and I would love to see better answers, right? Some of the answers are you stockpile for a while, right? And lots of nations have done this in the past, right? Famously, the USA stockpiling oil prior to wars to help avoid that. I think it was World War I. They actually, it doesn't matter. Anyway, there's history where they barely scraped through because people that weren't part of the government stockpiled well and saved their butts, basically. But so that's one thing, is stockpiling to a degree. Just like people stockpiling toilet paper for coronavirus is another example, right? And another one is where we try aggressively search for more elements in other countries, right? And that's starting to happen because the Europes and the USAs of the world are starting to realize China has a few more of these things, like too much control on some of these. That's very helpful. It's really good, right? Another one, which is a bit farther out, is asteroid mining, right? But it's farther out, but it's not necessarily that far out, right? So a friend of mine actually had a startup around asteroid mining and was pursuing it vigorously, but he was just a bit too early, right? So the point is, asteroid mining is close enough to actually realistically conceive of doing startups for asteroid mining, and I look forward to seeing more of those, right? Space is going to be a much bigger thing in VC land in coming years. And finally is, well, right now we have these entities called China and USA, right? And those are these sovereign states, right? And do we really need and want that, right? And there is this notion of the sovereign individual, and of course there's a tension between the individual wanting to have lots of power and the state, but ultimately the role of the state should be to help. The traditional role of the state has been to help to protect the individual and to give the individual a substrate to help improve their lives, right? And frankly, China has done a great job on that for citizens in the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years plus, right? That's why its citizens are really happy with China. Yes, there are human rights issues, but if you ask Chinese citizens, they're pretty happy with it all in all, because their lives are better off, right? They're getting fed better and better. Same thing with Russia, interestingly, because they believe their lives are getting better, right? So So that's but towards your your question, if we can move civilization towards where the influence of the nation fades more, where maybe it even disappears, but it fades a lot, where it's much more about the individual or at least the city, that can be a lot more valuable, right? So imagine that maybe China exists, but it's, sort of like the monarchy in the UK, right? It exists, but it's not really that important anymore. But instead, you have, cities that are each much more sovereign on their own, right? So, the dozens of big cities in China that are 1 million plus, 50 plus cities like that, each of them is more sovereign on its own. And guess what? This is the idea of the nation with the level of power it has is a very recent concept, right? The idea of a passport is an even more recent concept, right? Rewind a few hundred years, we had kingdoms and fiefdoms, right? And that was much more of the level of the city, if you will, right? So if we actually, and why did it shift towards the way it is now? There's many explanations, many plausible explanations. But the point is, a lot of actually, if you look at the explanations, a lot of them are based on the technology of the time and how technology changes things. So it's sort of this bottom-up thing that, in the long run, can really change things. And right now, we have a lot of technology that are much more empowering at the level of individuals and groups, right? And digital nations and all this. So blockchain technology has great promise for this. But also, we see other examples of this. Estonia has its e-residency program. What is that? It's a country, a nation, bequeathing rights to people, the rights as if you're a resident of Estonia, which is almost the level of the rights of a citizen. It's bequeathing these rights to be a resident of Estonia, even if you're not living in Estonia, even if you've never ever set foot in Estonia, you can get a lot of rights. You can open a bank account, you can start a company, etc. That's pretty cool, right? And Estonia itself actually views itself as a nation in a very evolutionary framework. It views that it's in competition with other countries, and it wants to provide the best services, the best bang for the buck to do so. And other smaller countries do that too, like Barbados and otherwise. But Estonia is interesting because it's a European country, right? And so, you can pay attention, you can ignore the super little guys that aren't in Europe. But when you start looking at like a country with 1 million plus people, that's, a European country, then you start to have to pay attention. And, I've been, I was fairly deeply involved in that program for a while, advising and so on. So I watched it and I was like amazing, super impressed with how the government of Estonia was run and how that program was rolled out. But ultimately, it is a shot across the bow of what it means to be a nation state. And that's a really healthy thing. And it's pointing to sort of this evolutionary pressure. And what they taught me is that other countries are coming to them and asking, okay, how do we do our own, right? To have our own e-residency to be competitive. And it can really help. So within about 3 years of Estonia rolling out its e-residency program, it doubled its GDP. Let that sink in for a second. Doubling the GDP of a country based on a single program, mostly a single program, in a span of a few years. That is amazing, right? They have like 70,000 e-residents, about 10% of them start companies. Those companies pay tax, that drives GDP, right? So I put myself in the shoes of someone running some other country, big or small. It's like, game on, let's compete, right? And then, if you can't compete, or maybe you want to start your own nation, right, a new country, that's really useful. So overall, on the rare earth question, how do we decentralize on that? There's a few potential solutions, right? Like I mentioned, there's stockpiling. There is trying to find alternative, trying to find more in other countries, trying to find alternative designs that don't need it, right? And finally, the fading of the nation state over time. Oh yeah, and asteroid mining. So quite a few solutions in a span of near.
Wow, that's a super long arch. Going to essentially where I started from, because the breaking of the nation state into smaller entities again might even happen if we not only on a technological substrate, but also because we have now culturally integrated the idea of distribution of power and wealth creation, which is the substrate that is required for true democracy. Only when wealth creation is truly distributed among every human, then every human has the power to start engaging in the governance processes. And so even if There are several category 5 solar storms and things like that that fry a lot of our infrastructure. I think that cultural element stays, and this is why we're here, because we want to figure out how we run these small communities and organizations. I think it's late for you. I know that I'm in a different time zone at the moment, so it's still quite early for me. So I want to bring this to a closing. At one point, I'd like to have a conversation with you about how you maintain your tremendous levels of energy. Imagining you doing homeschooling with the kids in the morning, running ocean during the day, and then having this conversation in the evening is very impressive, and keeping your focus and your attention that high. So thank you so much for all of these insights. I learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It was really fun, and I appreciate you letting me run at extended length on riffing on, many things that feel like sci-fi, but actually can be practically implemented, right? And can, really move the needle for civilization in the near term, right? Ding the universe, if you will.
Well, what I really enjoy is when you talk about Nature 2.0, coming from your background on a farm. It's a different thing than some high-flying engineer somewhere talking about the same thing, right? Because you've grown up in a natural, more or less natural environment on a farm, so you know what you're talking about in that sense, and that is very, very rare, and I enjoy that very much.
Thank you. Oh yeah, as a quick aside too, some people say, can farmland sustain, 10x, 100x more humans? The good thing is vertical farming is making amazing inroads in the last few years. So that's the path to scale there. And then we have the energy and we have the water and all that. We're good to go. But thank you.
Thank you for the positive note. I really need that at the moment.
For sure. Yes.
Okay, man.
Towards self-actualization.
Yes, always towards working on it.
All right, then.
Okay, man. Thank you so much. We'll close here, and I wish you a wonderful evening, the rest of the evening, and see you soon.
Thank you. All right. Bye.
Ciao.